Methuselah lived 969 years. Not a poetic exaggeration, not a rounding up of a long life into a memorable figure, but a specific number written into the oldest genealogy in the Hebrew Bible, the longest lifespan recorded anywhere in the text, and the reason his name became a byword for impossible age in every language that inherited these stories. And the moment you sit with that number, really sit with it, a strange and unsettling realization begins to form, because Methuselah was not unusual. His father Enoch was the odd one out, taken early. His grandfather lived 962 years. His son lived 777. His grandson Noah lived 950. In the world Genesis describes before the flood, a man who died at 600 had died comparatively young, and a lifespan that brushed against 1,000 years was simply what it meant to be human. And then, somewhere between the 5th and the 11th chapter of the same book, that world ends. The numbers collapse. The 1,000-year life vanishes, and by the time the text reaches the Psalms, a human lifespan has been reduced to 70 years, 80 if we are strong. The answer to why that happened, according to the tradition that preserved these stories, sits in a single passage so short you could read it in under a minute, and so strange that people have argued about its meaning for more than 2,000 years. To understand what that passage claims, you first have to feel the weight of the world it was claiming to change. And the genealogy of Genesis chapter 5 is one of the most quietly astonishing pieces of writing in the ancient world, precisely because it refuses to dramatize itself. It simply lists. A man is born. He lives a certain number of years. He fathers a son. He lives many more years. He fathers other sons and daughters. And then comes the phrase that repeats like a slow drumbeat down the entire chapter. And he died. And he died. And he died. 8 times across 10 generations the formula lands. And each time it is preceded by a span of years that would make a modern reader stop and reread. Adam, 930. Seth, 912. Enosh, 905. Kenan, 910. The numbers do not climb toward a single miraculous outlier and then fall back. They hold. Generation after generation, they hover in that vast register between 800 and nearly 1,000, as if longevity on that scale were not a gift to a chosen few, but the ordinary background condition of existence. The water these people swam in without ever noticing it was water. Now try to inhabit that, because the text is inviting you to imagine something your mind almost physically resists. Picture a span of 900 years not as a number but as lived time. A person born under those conditions would have watched not their grandchildren but their grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren grow old and have children of their own. They would have accumulated not decades of skill but centuries of it. A craftsman would have had 400 years to perfect a single trade. The memory of the very first generation, of Adam himself, would not have been ancient history passed down through a fog of retellings, but living testimony, because in a world of 1,000-year lives, Adam was still alive when Lamech, the father of Noah, was born. Read the chronology carefully and the overlaps are staggering. The first man and the father of the flood builder breathed the same air at the same time. Knowledge would not erode across generations, because the generations barely turned over. The same minds persisted, the same witnesses, the same hands. Whatever you believe about whether this actually happened, the world it describes is internally coherent in a way that is genuinely haunting, a civilization with the memory of a redwood forest. And here is where the contrast that drives this entire story first announces itself, because we do not live in that world, and the text knows we do not. The same scripture that records 969 years for Methuselah records, just a few chapters and a few centuries later, lifespans that have crumbled to a fraction of that. Something happened. The text is explicit that something happened. It does not present the long lives and the short lives as two unrelated facts sitting side by side. It presents them as a before and an after, with a hinge in between, and the hinge is the passage everyone fights about. So the question that the title of this story puts so bluntly is not a question the tradition invented to be provocative. It is a question the text itself raises by structuring the data the way it does. Why 800, 900, nearly 1,000 on one side of the line, and 70 or 80 on the other? What is the hinge, and what does it claim happened there? The hinge is Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and then the verse that follows like a verdict. And to read it cold for the first time is a disorienting experience, even for people raised on these stories, because it is unlike almost anything around it. The chapter opens with humanity multiplying across the face of the earth, daughters being born, and then a phrase drops into the narrative that has launched more interpretation than perhaps any four-word sequence in the Hebrew Bible. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives from among them. Any they chose. And the text continues, with the kind of compressed strangeness that suggests the original audience knew exactly what was meant while we are left straining at the edges, that there were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These, the text says, were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And right in the middle of that passage, before the Nephilim are even mentioned, comes the line that the entire question of human lifespan hangs upon. God says, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. 120 years. There it is, dropped into the text without explanation, a divine declaration that seems to set a ceiling, a limit, a new boundary line drawn through human existence. And you can immediately see why so many readers across so many centuries took this to be the answer in its plainest form. God looked at a humanity that had been living for the better part of a millennium, decided that this was no longer how it would be, and capped it. The 1,000-year life was over. From now on, 120. And the elegance of that reading is that the text seems to confirm it through the rest of its own pages, because the lifespans really do begin to fall after this point, and they fall toward exactly that number. Noah, who straddles the old world and the new, still lives 950, but his son Shem lives 600. And from there, the decline is relentless and almost mathematical. Each generation in the genealogy of chapter 11 shedding years like a falling tide, until you reach Abraham at 175, and then his descendants in the range of 120 to 140, and finally Moses, who dies at exactly 120 years, with the text pointedly noting that his eye was not dim, nor his strength gone, as if to say, this is the new limit, and he reached it intact. The number from Genesis 6 does not stay an abstraction. It becomes the boundary of a human life. But, and this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating rather than simply being a tidy explanation, that plain reading has never been the only reading, and the people who knew this text best, who studied it in its original language for centuries, were never fully convinced that the 120 years referred to lifespan at all, because the verse is ambiguous in the Hebrew in a way that English translations tend to smooth over. And there is a second interpretation that is at least as old and arguably better supported by the immediate context. In this reading, the 120 years is not a cap on how long any individual will live. It is a countdown. It is a deadline. God, looking at the corruption spreading through the world described in these verses, is announcing not a new lifespan, but a window of grace. 120 years before judgment falls. A final stretch of time in which humanity might change course before the flood arrives to wash the old world away. And the reason this reading is so compelling is that the very next thing the chapter does is introduce Noah and the ark and the coming deluge. The 120 years on this view is the span of Noah's warning, the patient delay between the verdict and its execution, the years in which the ark was built in full view of a world that did not believe the rain would ever come. These two readings pull in completely different directions, and which one you accept changes the entire meaning of the passage, so it is worth slowing down to feel the stakes. If the 120 years is a lifespan cap, then Genesis 6 is the answer to our question directly and explicitly. This is the verse where God reduced human life from its ancient near-millennial scale down toward the figure we would recognize, the moment the long ages ended by divine decree. But if the 120 years is a countdown to the flood, then this famous verse is not actually about lifespan at all, and the dramatic decline in human ages that the genealogies record must be explained some other way, by some other mechanism that the text shows us through its numbers rather than states in a single sentence. And the strange, productive tension at the heart of this whole subject is that the evidence does not cleanly favor either side. The text gives us a verse that sounds like a lifespan limit, and then a genealogy that behaves like the result of one, but it also gives us a context drenched in flood and judgment that makes the countdown reading feel like the more natural fit. People who have devoted their lives to this passage have landed on both sides, and the honest position is that the text holds both possibilities in suspension, daring us to decide. What almost everyone agrees on, across every reading, is that the decline in lifespan is somehow bound up with the larger story Genesis 6 is telling. And that story is one of a creation drifting away from what it was meant to be. The chapter does not present the shortening of human life as an arbitrary punishment or a random adjustment. It presents it inside a narrative arc in which the Spirit of God will no longer remain in flesh that has turned away, in which the boundary between the human and something beyond the human has been transgressed in those mysterious verses about the sons of God, and in which the whole world has filled with a corruption so total that the text reaches for almost unbearable language to describe it, saying that every intention of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually, and that God regretted having made humanity at all. The reduction of lifespan, in other words, is not a footnote to this story. It is one of its load-bearing themes. The shortening of human life is presented as inseparable from the spiritual condition of the world, a physical consequence woven into a moral and theological catastrophe. And this is the point where the question stops being a riddle about numbers and starts being a window into how an entire ancient worldview understood the relationship between life, time, and the divine. To the people who wrote and preserved these texts, length of life was never a neutral biological fact. It was a measure of standing, of blessing, of how close or how far a person and a people stood from the source of life itself. A long life was the visible sign of a right relationship with God. The genealogy of chapter 5, with its slow drumbeat of enormous ages, is in this sense a portrait of humanity still near the beginning, still close to the breath that had been breathed into the first man, still drawing on a vitality that had not yet been spent. The shortening that follows is not merely demographic. It is the story of a distance opening up, of a world moving away from its origin, of the breath of life being, in the words of the verse, no longer permitted to abide in flesh forever. When you read it this way, the collapse of human lifespan across the chapters of Genesis is not a problem to be solved, but a story being told in the only vocabulary that mattered to its tellers, the vocabulary of years, of generations, of who lived how long and what that length revealed about the state of the world. There is one more dimension to all of this that makes the question richer still, and it is the fact that the Hebrews who recorded these astonishing ages were not alone in their part of the world in remembering a primeval age of superhuman lifespans. The civilizations surrounding ancient Israel preserved their own lists of legendary rulers from before a great flood, and those lists assign their figures spans of time that make even Methuselah seem modest. Reigns recorded not in centuries, but in tens of thousands of years. Kings who supposedly governed for spans that dwarf anything in the biblical genealogies. And then, after their own version of a cataclysmic deluge, a sudden and dramatic shortening of the recorded reigns down to something approaching ordinary human scale. The pattern is unmistakable, and it appears across the region. A remembered age of immense longevity, a flood that divides time itself, and a diminished world on the other side. Whether you read this as independent cultures preserving a shared memory of something real, or as a common ancient way of marking the distance between the mythic deep past and the historical present, the fact that the biblical account fits this wider pattern is genuinely striking, and it tells us that the question of why the ancients believed lifespans had collapsed was not a peculiarly Hebrew obsession. It was something close to a universal preoccupation of the early literate world, a shared attempt to explain why the heroes of the deep past seem to have lived on a scale that no living person ever would again. The strangeness of those 4 verses about the sons of God and the daughters of men deserves a closer look, because they are positioned in the text as something more than a curiosity, sitting as they do directly between the declaration about the 120 years and the verdict that human wickedness had become total. For most of 2,000 years, 3 main ways of understanding that passage have competed, and each one casts the question of lifespan in a different light. The oldest interpretation, the one held by the earliest readers of these texts and reflected in some of the most ancient writings outside the Bible, took the sons of God to be heavenly beings, members of the divine council who crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed and joined themselves to human women. In this reading, the corruption that triggers the flood is not merely moral, but cosmic. A violation of the order separating the heavenly from the earthly, and the offspring of that union, the Nephilim, are the mighty men of renown, figures of immense power whose very existence is a sign that the world has gone catastrophically out of joint. On this view, the shortening of human life and the announcement that God's Spirit will not abide in flesh forever are direct responses to that transgression, a divine reining in of a creation that had begun to blur the line between the human and the more than human. A second interpretation, which gained enormous influence in later centuries, read the sons of God not as heavenly beings, but as the godly line of Seth, the faithful descendants of Adam's son who carried the worship of God forward, while the daughters of men were the descendants of Cain, the line marked from the beginning by violence and estrangement. On this reading, the catastrophe is intermarriage between the faithful and the faithless, the slow dissolving of a holy community into the surrounding corruption until there was no meaningful difference left, until the godly line had been so thoroughly absorbed that only one family, Noah's, remained untainted. A third reading, rooted in the ancient world's own categories, understood the sons of God as kings and rulers, powerful men who took whatever women they wanted by force of status, the phrase, any they chose, carrying a darker connotation of unchecked power seizing what it desired. What unites all 3 readings, despite their deep differences, is that they all understand these verses as describing a boundary being violated, a proper order being overrun, and they all place the declaration about the 120 years in the position of a response to that violation. Whether the boundary crossed was between heaven and earth, between the holy and the profane, or between power and the powerless, the text presents the limiting of human life as bound up with the consequence of that transgression. And then comes the flood, the event that the entire passage has been building toward, the great hinge that divides the world of the 1,000-year lives from everything that follows. It is essential to understand how the text uses the flood, because it functions as far more than a disaster in the narrative. It is a boundary in time itself, a line drawn across history so absolute that the world on the far side of it is presented as a fundamentally different place from the world before. Before the flood, the genealogies hum with their enormous numbers, generation after generation living for the better part of a millennium. The flood arrives, the old world is unmade, and when the waters recede and the narrative resumes its counting, the numbers have begun their long descent. Noah himself is the bridge between the 2 worlds, born into the age of the ancients and living his 950 years, but his life is split by the deluge, 600 years on the old side of it and 350 on the new. He is the last man to live on the old scale, and the text seems aware of it, because no one born entirely after the flood ever approaches his age again. What happens to the numbers in the chapters after the flood is one of the most remarkable features of the whole biblical genealogy, and it rewards close attention because the pattern is so consistent that it almost feels designed. In the genealogy of Genesis 11, which traces the line from Noah's son Shem down to Abraham, the lifespans fall in a smooth and unmistakable curve. Shem lives 600 years. His son lives 438. The next generation, 433, then 464, then a sharp drop to 239, then 239 again, then 230, then 148, and then Abraham's father Terah at 205. The descent is not perfectly linear, but the trend is undeniable and dramatic. In the space of 10 generations after the flood, the recorded human lifespan falls from 600 years to under 200, a collapse of 2/3 in the span of a single genealogical chapter. If you were to plot these numbers, you would see not a cliff but a slope, a decay curve, the kind of curve that suggests not a single decree applied uniformly, but a process unfolding across generations, something draining away from the human constitution a little more with each turn of the family tree. This is the detail that makes the countdown reading of the 120 years so much more interesting than it first appears, because if the 120 years was a hard cap on lifespan imposed at Genesis 6, you would expect lifespans to drop to 120 and stay there. Instead, what the genealogies actually show is people living far longer than 120 for many generations after the flood, 600 years, 400 years, 200 years, and only gradually approaching the lower figure across a long descent. Abraham dies at 175, well above the supposed cap, centuries after the decree was allegedly spoken. His son Isaac lives 180, his grandson Jacob 147, Joseph 110. The numbers are still falling, still in motion, still settling toward a floor they have not yet reached. This is precisely what you would expect if the shortening of life were a gradual physical consequence of the changed world after the flood, a slow attenuation of an original vitality, rather than the instantaneous application of a numerical limit. And it is precisely what you would not expect if the 120 years were a simple lifespan cap switched on at a single moment. The very data that seems at first to confirm the plain reading, on closer inspection, quietly undermines it, and points instead toward the picture of a world progressively losing something it once had in abundance. People who have wrestled with this have offered a range of explanations for why the post-flood world would drain human life away so steadily, and while the text itself does not spell out a mechanism, the explanations are worth understanding because they reveal how seriously readers have taken the consistency of the pattern. Some have proposed that the world before the flood was simply a different kind of environment, that conditions on the earth had changed so fundamentally that the human body could no longer sustain itself the way it once had, and that the generations after the deluge were living through the slow physiological consequence of that transformation, each one a little less able to draw on the old vitality than the one before. Others have framed it in more straightforwardly theological terms, as the cumulative effect of a humanity moving ever further from its origin, the breath of life that had been breathed into the first man growing fainter in his descendants with every generation that turned away. What is striking is that both kinds of explanation, the environmental and the theological, are trying to account for the same observed feature of the text, not a sudden cut, but a gradual fade, a curve rather than a cliff. A sense that whatever sustained the 1,000-year lives was being spent down across the post-flood generations until it reached a kind of equilibrium at the human scale we now know. By the time you reach the era of the patriarchs, that equilibrium is nearly in view. Abraham at 175 is still extraordinary by our standards, but he is no Methuselah. He belongs recognizably to a more human order of things, a man who experiences old age, who buries his wife and worries about his heir, whose long life is presented as a blessing precisely because it is no longer simply the default. And then comes the figure who stands, in the tradition, as the great marker of the new human limit, Moses, who according to the text died at exactly 120 years, the very number spoken in Genesis 6. The placement is too neat to be accidental in the eyes of the tradition. Whatever the 120 years originally meant, by the time Moses dies at precisely that age, with the text emphasizing that his vigor was undiminished to the end, the number has come to function as a symbol of the outermost boundary of a human life lived to its fullest extent. And then, just a few generations later, Even that boundary recedes, because by the time the Psalms are composed, the figure given for the span of human life is no longer 120 but 70 or 80 for the strong, with the bleak addition that even those years are full of toil and trouble and pass quickly away. The descent that began at the flood has reached its floor, and that floor is the human lifespan we still live within today. Sit with that final figure for a moment, because it is the most quietly astonishing detail in the entire arc. The number that the Hebrew poets settled on thousands of years ago as the realistic span of a human life, 70 years, 80 if we are strong, is almost exactly the number a modern actuary would give you. For most of recorded history, in most of the world, average life expectancy at birth was dragged down by staggering rates of infant and child mortality. But for those who survived into adulthood, the natural span of a human life that ended of old age, rather than of disease or violence, has hovered with remarkable stability around exactly that range. The 70 to 80 figure was not a low estimate born of an unhealthy ancient world. It was, if anything, an accurate reading of the upper edge of normal human longevity, the same upper edge we bump against now even with all our medicine. We have become vastly better at getting people to that age by defeating the diseases and dangers that used to cut life short along the way, but we have barely moved the ceiling itself. The ancient poet who wrote that our days are 70 years was describing the same wall that the longevity researchers of the present day are still trying, and largely failing, to push past. Across all the centuries between, the number held. This is the contrast that turns the whole subject from an ancient puzzle into something that touches the present directly, because the question the title asks, why human lifespans fell from the hundreds to the range of 80, is in a strange and inverted way the same question that some of the most ambitious scientific work of our own era is trying to answer from the opposite direction. The text describes a fall from immense longevity down to 80 years and frames it as a consequence of a world moving away from its source of life. The science of the present describes a hard biological ceiling at roughly that same 80 to 120 range, and is pouring enormous resources into the question of why the human body seems to wear out on that schedule, and whether anything can be done to extend it. Whatever you believe about the historical reality of the patriarchal ages, the convergence is genuinely arresting. An ancient text and a modern laboratory, separated by thousands of years and by an entire revolution in how human beings understand the world, both circling the same fixed point, both fascinated by the same boundary, both asking why a human life ends roughly when it does, and whether it always had to be that way. Which leads me to the question I most want to leave with you before we close, and it is this. When you read that the natural span of a human life is 70 years, or 80 if we are strong, and you realize that this number set down thousands of years ago is still essentially the number we live by today, does that strike you as evidence that the ancient writers were simply describing the world they observed with unusual accuracy? Or does it suggest they had glimpsed something about the human condition that we have spent 3,000 years confirming without ever managing to overturn? I would genuinely like to know how that lands for you. What makes the Genesis account so durable, so endlessly returned to and argued over, is that it refuses to be merely a story about numbers, even though numbers are its medium. Underneath the genealogies and the lifespans and the famous declaration about the 120 years, it is telling a story about what it means to be a creature that lives and dies, about the relationship between the length of a life and the state of the world that life is lived in, and about a primeval rupture whose consequences are still being counted in the only unit that the ancient world found unanswerable, the years of a human life. The reduction of lifespan, in the logic of the text, is not a punishment in any petty or vindictive sense. It is described almost as an act of restraint, even of mercy, in that strange line where God says his spirit will not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. There is a reading of that verse in which the shortening of life is not God taking something away in anger, but God refusing to let a corrupted existence stretch on without end, drawing a boundary around suffering, ensuring that no individual would carry the full weight of a fallen world across 1,000 years. A finite life, on that reading, is not only a loss, It is a limit on how much any one person must endure, a mercy disguised as a sentence. And here is where the whole arc finally turns back toward us and asks to be felt rather than merely understood. Because every one of us is living inside the answer to the question the title posed. The 70 years, the 80 if we are strong, is not an abstraction in a genealogy. It is the shape of your own life and the lives of everyone you love. The reason a human existence has the particular weight and urgency that it does. If we lived for 900 years, the loss of a single year would mean almost nothing, a rounding error in an ocean of time. It is precisely because our days are numbered in the range the ancient poets named that each one carries the weight it carries, that a decade matters, that the question of how we spend our brief allotment is the most pressing question a person ever faces. The text frames the shortening of life as the end of something, the close of a golden age of impossible longevity, and reads as a kind of diminishment. But turn it over and the same fact reveals its other face, because the very brevity that the text presents as loss is also the precise source of everything that gives a human life its meaning, its intensity, its preciousness. The boundary that was drawn around our years is the same boundary that makes those years matter at all. The ancient world looked at the collapse from 900 years to 80 and saw a fall. We can look at the 80 years we are given and recognize that the limit is not only what we lost, but what makes us human in the first place. The frame that turns mere existence into a life with stakes. If this is the kind of question that pulls you in, the kind where an ancient text and the deepest puzzles of the present turn out to be staring at the same mystery from opposite ends of time, then stay with this channel. Because finding the places where the oldest stories quietly anticipate the questions we are still asking is exactly what we do here, and there is so much more of it waiting. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, someone who would lie awake turning over the strange convergence of a 3,000-year-old poem and a modern laboratory, both landing on the same number for the length of a human life, send this to them, because a mystery like this one only deepens when there is someone to wonder at it alongside you. The years we are given are few, the ancient poet said, and full of trouble, and they pass quickly away, which is precisely why what we choose to fill them with and who we choose to share the wondering with may be the only answer to the question of our lifespan that was ever truly ours to give.